Welcome back to another Crusty Cravings video. I'm Hannah and I'm a sourdough microbaker in Fort Myers, Florida. I've been doing that for the last 9 months and I've been making sourdough for over 3 years. I am feeding my sourdough starter on vacation and I wanted to show you how I do it and my process and explain feeding ratios. You probably have a sourdough starter if you're watching this, but you don't know a lot about how to feed, how to get an exact amount of starter, and what kind of ratios to feed it with, or the science behind it. And so that's what I want to explain today. So to feed your sourdough starter, I recommend to have a food scale because that is going to be the most accurate way. Some people have you feed with measuring cups and some people recommend eyeballing your feeds based off of consistency. And neither of those are going to be very accurate and get you an exact amount of starter. If you go the measuring cup route, you are going to make a massive amount of starter typically if you're just used to making 1 to 2 loaves, and you will have a lot of discard, especially if you're feeding with 1 cup at a time. You're gonna have to discard possibly half of that, and you're going to create a massive amount of waste if you can't get through all of your discard. I recommend investing in a food scale. It is going to make you a lot more accurate with your feeds. It's going to be more predictable. You will start to see what ratios peak at what times. And so you know exactly when to feed for when you want to mix your dough. It will create less waste. You'll be discarding less flour and water. And ultimately, you're going to just save yourself a lot of headache once you know how to predict when your starter is going to peak. Ratio is simply just starter to flour to water in grams. So when people talk about ratios, that's all they're referring to. You can manipulate your starter, your flour, and your water to get a different result, to get a different amount of starter, and to make it peak in a different amount of time. I like to feed with a 1 to 1 to 1 when I want to mix dough within 3 to 4 hours. I do a 1 to 5 to 5 when I want it to peak within 7 hours. And I will do a 1 to 10 to 10 when I want it to peak within 12 hours. So depending on what time I want to mix dough, I just change the ratio. And all you have to do is multiply your starter amount that you're carrying over by the ratio to get the amount of flour and water that you want in your ratio. And I'm also going to link a calculator that my friend Rebecca made that just makes it easier for people who struggle with math. What you need when feeding is a food scale, your starter, unbleached flour of some kind. I use bread flour, all-purpose flour, whole wheat flour, spelt flour, rye flour. And the higher the protein content in your flour and the way that it's milled is going to impact your starter's health, the consistency, the taste, and the texture. But ultimately, starters love higher protein flours and flours that contain the whole germ and bran of your wheat berry. So if you did whole wheat, your starter's gonna love it. I tend to do a blend of flours or just stick with all-purpose or bread flour primarily. You need something to mix the starter with. You're gonna need water. In this case, I'm doing filtered water or bottled water, and I warmed it up because this house is super cold. The heat impacts how fast your starter is going to grow and the health of your starter. You need it to be on the warmer side, anywhere from 75 to 85 degrees, because that's what your starter loves. If it's any colder or if it's any hotter, sometimes the bacteria can die, and I prefer it just to be within that temperature. I just need something to scoop my flour with, and that's it. It's pretty simple. Every food scale has a tar option or a zero out function. So you put whatever vessel you're going to be feeding your starter in on the food scale, and you hit the tar button and it zeroes it out. So all I have to do is take a portion of starter. In this case, it is just a maintenance feed. And so I really don't need that much. I'm just gonna take 10 grams. Okay, let's see. It's 10 grams. And I'm going to feed it a 1 to 1 to 1 ratio. So all I have to do is take 10 grams of starter and equal parts flour and water in this case. So 10 grams of flour and 10 grams of water. That's it. That's a 1-to-1 feeding ratio. It's going to take 3 to 4 hours to peak in the right environment. Again, if your house is colder, it's going to take a lot longer. If it's warmer, it's going to speed it up a little bit. So it could take as little as 2 hours. You zero it out after you have put in your starter amount. I always do water next. I try to mix that because I want the starter to be well incorporated in the water. All I have to do is hit tar again and take 10 grams of my organic unbleached bread flour. A 1-to-1-to-1 ratio is going to feel like a thick pancake batter consistency. So if you do want to eyeball your feed, that is the easiest ratio to eyeball. The other ratios are extremely hard to eyeball, and there's no way to know exact ratios when you're just going off of consistency. It's going to be unpredictable because you won't know when it's going to peak. I know a 1-to-1 peaks within 3 to 4 hours for me, but if I was going off of consistency, I could accidentally feed it a much higher or lower ratio. If I fed it less flour and water than starter, it would become acidic really easily because your starter needs a bare minimum of a 1-to-1 feeding ratio to really be healthy and thriving. If you fed too much, it would just take a lot longer to peak. It would, again, be unpredictable. So that's all I needed to do. I just loosely cover it with something. I didn't have a thin tea towel, cloth, or anything like that. I don't have a rubber band. I don't have anything to mark it with. So I'm just gonna loosely cover it with this lid, not seal it. The reason being is CO2 is gonna build up within this jar, and if it was completely sealed, it would explode. So I just want to loosely cover it, something that's breathable. A lot of people ask me, well, how do you know how much to feed it and what ratio to get a certain amount or an exact amount of starter? So this is pretty simple. All you have to do is calculate the total amount of starter you need in your recipe. Say your recipe calls for 100 grams of starter for 1 loaf. You would just take that 100 grams and divide it by 3 if you're doing a 1-to-1-to-1 feeding ratio, and that gives you the exact amount that you would need to feed your starter in order to get 100 grams. Some people will take a small portion of their main starter or their mother starter and put it in a separate jar and give it an exact amount of flour and water to create a levain, which is an exact amount of starter needed or an offshoot of your starter for a specific recipe. So say you wanted to create a sweet, stiff starter. You could take a small portion of your mother starter and feed it a ratio of sugar to flour to water to create an exact amount of starter or a levain for that specific recipe. And say you needed 150 grams of starter. You take a small portion of your mother starter. Say you need 150, that would just be divided by 3 for a 1-to-1-to-1. So you would need 50 grams of starter, 50 grams of flour, 50 grams of water to create an exact amount of starter, 150 grams for your recipe. I do a levain when I'm doing bulk dough days because I need to calculate the total amount of starter I need for my cinnamon rolls, my bread, anything that requires active starter, pizza dough. I'm calculating the total amount of starter needed, and then I have to figure out the ratio that I want to feed it based off of when I want it to peak. I typically do a 1-to-10-to-10 ratio because I feed overnight and it takes 12 hours to peak. So I take an exact amount of starter, feed it an exact amount of flour, an exact amount of water to get the total amount of starter I need for my recipe. And I do that in a separate tub. So that is called a levain. It's an offshoot of your mother starter. You don't have to do that. Some people prefer just to maintain one jar and have one discard jar. They just have their mother starter and their discard, and that's it. And that's fine. You don't have to create a levain. I do, personally. So when it comes to creating a mass amount of levain for a bulk dough day or a recipe, All you have to know is the total amount of starter needed, know what ratio you're going to feed it, know the timing behind that ratio, and basically do the math to figure out how much starter you're going to come up with at the end. You just have to add up the total amount of starter and flour and water you're putting into your levain, and that gives you the total amount of active starter you're going to be making. I do notice that somehow the gas in the fermentation process reduces the amount of total grams of active starter the next day, not by much, but it could be 50 to 100 grams. And I also sometimes have mess ups and need extra starter. So I never add in the starter that I'm putting into the levain and count it towards my total amount of active starter. All I do is calculate the total amount of starter I need, or the total amount of levain that I need. I divide it by 2 because I am feeding with equal parts of flour and water. And say I need 1,000 grams of levain. All I'm doing is calculating that I need 500 grams of flour, 500 grams of water, and then whatever ratio I'm feeding with, say it's a 1 to 10 to 10 ratio, I just take 500 grams and divide it by 10, and that gives me the starter amount that I need to begin with. And in that case, I would need 50 grams. So I'm just taking 50 grams of starter, 500 grams of flour, 500 grams of water, and that gives me 1,050 grams of active starter. But again, somehow with the fermentation process and the gases that are released, you end up with somehow getting less grams than what you started with. So I probably would lose like 25, 50 grams in the process of it rising and fermenting, and I need an exact amount. So again, I don't count the starter to the total amount that I need. So I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions about ratios, feeding, maintenance in general, please ask me in the comments and I'll be happy to answer. But starter maintenance, ratios, feeding with a food scale, it's all a lot more simple than people make it seem. And I think feeding with a food scale is actually easier than doing cups and consistency because it makes you more accurate. So thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed. If you like this content, please subscribe, like, comment, and follow me on Instagram and TikTok. A ratio is simply just starter to flour to water in grams. And depending on the manipulation, okay. Ratio is just starter to flour to water in grams, and you can manipulate your flour and water amounts to predict, oh my gosh, how do I want to say that? I have to just do, oh my gosh. So when it comes to creating a mass amount of leaven for